Good afternoon. I'm Marissa King, a professor at the Yale School of Management and professor of health policy and management at the Yale School of Public Health. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Vivek H. Murthy, a 2003 graduate of Yale School of Management and the Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Murthy served as a Surgeon General from 2014 to 2017. Prior to that, Dr. Murthy was previously an attending physician at Brigham Women's Hospital and the president and co-founder of Doctors for America. Welcome, Dr. Murthy.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you today.
It's fantastic to be able to speak with you. So I'd love to begin by just getting your assessment of what the state of public health in the United States is. What do you think are some of the most pressing health challenges that America is facing right now?
Well, I think we hear and read about public health all the time on the news, and for good reason, because there are big challenges that are facing us. The one that has been covered quite extensively in recent years has been the opioid epidemic, which is part of a larger challenge we have around the topic of addiction. And this is a problem not just in America, where nearly 21 million people are affected, but it's become an increasing problem around the world. In addition to addiction, there are other chronic illnesses that we have been struggling with for a while now, and those include cardiovascular disease and diabetes. These are two of the leading causes of disability, death, and healthcare costs in our country. And when combined with cancer, they make up some of the leading causes that are driving our healthcare system of death and morbidity. So as we think about how to address these challenges, though, there's a temptation that I think it's important to avoid. And that's a temptation to look at each of these as siloed issues and to try to think, okay, how do we build an isolated strategy for cardiovascular disease, a strategy for diabetes, a strategy for breast cancer, a strategy for colon cancer, a strategy for addiction. The truth is, while we do need to take specific approaches to these various public health challenges, there are deeper root causes that tie these issues together, root causes that are often connected to lifestyle choices that we make, but also connected to environmental factors that people may or may not have control over. And one of my interests when I was serving as Surgeon General, and an ongoing interest of mine now, is to think about those upstream factors that contribute to a variety of public health challenges and to see how we can address those. And going further upstream isn't always easy. Sometimes it gets complicated, but I believe that that's where, for lack of a better word, the money is. That's where we're going to see the biggest return for our investment when it comes to addressing public health threats.
And if we look at challenges that are arising, the opioid addiction, increases in cardiovascular disease, what do you think some of those upstream causes are?
Well, I think if you look broadly at chronic illness, I think we know that there is a major contribution from nutrition or from undernutrition, as it would be. And there's also a challenge that we face with physical activity. And let me just talk about these two for a moment, and there's a third I want to touch on. If you think about nutrition, we have been able to ensure that more people have access to food now than did 50 years ago, and certainly than 100 years ago. The challenge is, what kind of food do they have access to? What kind of food is affordable for people, especially on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum? And it turns out that for many people in our country, having access to healthy food that is in fact also affordable is in fact a great challenge. There also is a lot of confusion in the world of nutrition, particularly among the general public, when they try to ask the simple question, what should I eat? And that seems to change from time to time. One day we're told that fats are bad, the next day we're told that carbs are bad, the next day we're told that both are good. And so there's a lot of understandable confusion in the public about what really constitutes good nutrition. But the bottom line is that many of our nutritional choices are products of our environment. When healthy choices are in fact available, when they're affordable, and when they're convenient, people tend to make them, but far too many people live in circumstances where that's not the case. Physical activity is a challenge as well, because we have a situation in the United States right now where a substantial number of people live in neighborhoods that don't even have sidewalks. So when we tell people, you should be physically active, try to walk more in your day, be more active, that's easier said than done for some people. We also live in a culture where in many of our cities, driving is a primary means of getting around, and walking to the store or to school just isn't feasible for a lot of people. And so that shift toward a more sedentary lifestyle also has an impact. But I do think that the third factor, the third upstream contributor that's worth mentioning is our emotional health and well-being. The more we learn about emotions, the more we realize that they are a powerful force that affects all dimensions of our life. And we now know that stress, for example, also can be thought of as a lack of emotional well-being. We know that chronic stress can in fact have severe effects on our health in the long term. I want to make a distinction here, though, between acute stress and chronic stress. We know, for example, that when you have stress for short, intermittent periods of time, that can help build you up, that can help make you more resilient and stronger over time. That's the case, for example, when you go to the gym, and which is actually a form of stressing your body. If I were to lift weights, for example, contract my muscle, relax my muscle, contract and relax. If I keep doing that over time, I will build my muscle. But if I take a weight and I curl it, and then I hold that position for, let's say, 24 hours, that's going to cause damage to my muscle in the end. And that's essentially what's happening when your body is in a state of chronic stress. And unfortunately, we are in a situation where many people, including school children, are experiencing high levels of chronic stress. And that leads to greater degrees of inflammation in the body, which can lead to damages to tissues and blood vessels, and ultimately can contribute to a higher risk of diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, and a host of other chronic conditions that we care about.
So you've written extensively about some of the emotional challenges. You just talked about chronic stress. You've also written about loneliness as being one of the deeper root causes, and we know that there's a lot of research now linking loneliness also to health outcomes. So people who report being lonely are at as high of a risk of increased death, premature death, as someone who smokes 15 cigarettes a day. But these conversations, it seems like they're starting to bubble up, but still seems to be a disconnect linking emotional health and well-being and stress to physical outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about why you think maybe these conversations are just now starting to surface or haven't surfaced before, and what can be done to increase public awareness about the importance of these underlying issues?
Well, it's a great question. You're absolutely right that there are more conversations starting to surface now about the power and importance of emotions. But what is happening is that those conversations are running up against a cultural grain that for decades has run in a direction that tells us that emotions are in fact a source of weakness, not a source of strength, which has told us that your emotions are your personal business to deal with, but your physical health is completely different from that. And we have learned more and more through science that that is just not the case. Our head and our heart and the rest of our body are in fact all connected to each other. Our emotions impact our physical body. Our physical body in turn has an impact on our emotions. So we can't separate one from the other. And this is something that I saw very early on in my medical practice. I went through medical school at a time where there wasn't a whole lot of training and emphasis on thinking about a patient's emotional well-being or understanding how that impacted them. But what I did realize in practicing medicine was that there were so many circumstances where it became clear that without a patient being emotionally well, it was going to be hard for us to really focus on their physical health and well-being. And anyone who has either cared for someone who has been ill or has been ill themselves, or if you're a doctor or nurse who's listening who's been caring for patients, you know that if your patient is in a state of chronic stress or if they're experiencing depression, then it can make it harder for them to, for example, take their medicines and to keep track of those. It can make it harder for them to get engaged in their plan of care. So there's a real link here that I was seeing very early on in my medical practice. And the more and more, I travel our country and talk to communities, I have come to realize that this is something that people are experiencing, which is a lack of emotional well-being, a sense of emotional pain. It was one of the first things I saw when I began my tenure as Surgeon General. I began traveling the country as part of a listening tour. And what I heard in the stories of people everywhere were stories of pain, not just physical pain, but a deeper emotional pain that sometimes resulted from chronic illness. Sometimes it was a product of violence in their community. Sometimes it was a product of economic uncertainty. And at times it was a product of discrimination or exclusion. But whatever the cause was, the common denominator was that many of these people were experiencing a deeper pain, a sense of chronic stress, and that in turn was having negative effects on their health. If we want to change this, if we want to make emotions part of how we think about people and well-being and health, if we want to figure out how to use emotions to in fact enhance our productivity, our performance, and ultimately, and most importantly, our fulfillment in our lives, then we have to make a cultural shift. We have to recognize that emotions are not a source of weakness, but they are in fact an extraordinary source of power and healing when understood and when cultivated appropriately.
What role do you think that social institutions, if we think about the workplace or businesses, schools, or other larger social institutions, what role do you think they play in sort of both contributing to this increase in emotional pain, and what role do you think that they can help play in both reshaping the conversation or the discussions around pain and emotional vulnerability, as well as are there specific actions that they can take to help increase emotional well-being, whether that be at schools or in the workplace or in the community?
Well, institutions, I think, play an incredibly powerful role here. You know, to start off with, many people are spending significant portions of their lives in social institutions and educational institutions. They're either working there, they're taking classes there, and that community in those institutions has a powerful impact on their own emotional well-being. But social institutions and educational institutions in particular have a powerful role that they can play in creating models of how we incorporate emotional well-being into our day-to-day lives, into our culture in these institutions. They can also play an important role in studying the impact of emotional well-being, whether it's in the workplace, in schools, or in society at large. And I emphasize this in part because for many researchers that I have talked to, they have worried that if they were to, for example, focus on topics like emotional health and well-being, that they may not be seen as serious researchers. And this is part of the culture we have to change even within academia, is to recognize that this is actually an essential area of focus that we need to have both in research as well as in practice and application. And for that reason, it should be one of the areas that educational institutions focus on. But I do think that institutions can be leaders, they can be role models, and most importantly, they can be homes and real communities for people who want to optimize how they're functioning, who want to be a part of a true community. You know, I've had the privilege of studying at institutions over time that have given me a great education, and Yale School of Management was one of them, and very proud to be a Yale SOM graduate. And I think about my experiences in those institutions where I came to the institution hoping that I would be a part of a large community of people who I could share with, who I could learn from, and who I could, enjoy my experience of learning with. And at Yale School of Management, I was really fortunate to find some amazing people, both in the form of faculty members and fellow students and students who were a year above me, who were just wonderful people who, created a sense of home for me at the School of Management. And that was really powerful, feeling a sense of inclusion, feeling connected to the people around me, enhanced my own emotional well-being from day to day. It helped me stay more engaged in my coursework. It gave me more energy to go through the day. When I came to work, to school, each day, I felt that I was coming not only to learn, but to spend time with people I had come to love. And that kind of environment has an impact on not just how people feel, but on how they perform. We know in the workplace, for example, that when people don't feel that they are connected to the people they are working with, that has a negative effect on their engagement, which can in fact impact their productivity as well as their creativity. We know that when people are feeling excluded from work, either because of their gender or their sexual preference or their race or for other reasons, that can create a sense of chronic stress over time. And chronic stress hijacks your frontal lobe, which controls your executive function and your decision making, and it can impair your ability to fully be and perform to your fullest ability. So, institutions, I think, have a really powerful role that they can play, and I think that it's time that they recognize the power of what they can create by developing and cultivating a strong sense of connection between the people who work and live in those institutions.
I'm happy to hear that you found that during your time here at SOM. Are there other examples that you've had as either in your own medical practice, during your experience as Surgeon General, or have seen in your tours around the country of other companies or teams working to create an inclusive environment and how that's impacted both employees' productivity or also their well-being?
Sure. Well, fortunately, there are more and more organizations that are recognizing the importance of cultivating connection between people. And I was actually just at an event in Boston yesterday where we were talking just about this, about the power of addressing loneliness in the workplace. And I found that there are more employers, coming to talks like that who want to know, hey, what can I do and what's actually working? I've actually seen this sort of being done well in a number of somewhat unexpected places. So, for example, I have found that there are schools that I have come across in the country which have recognized that their students are sometimes often feeling disconnected from each other, and that they are partly as a result not doing as well as they can in school, but also getting into fights, and the disciplinary actions were going up. So some of the schools that I have visited, including actually a school in Hamden, Connecticut, that's working with Yale, that they have developed programs to actually train their students in emotional well-being. And what they've done is given them a language to talk about emotions, help them understand the power of emotions, help them troubleshoot when they're experiencing negative emotions, and help them figure out how do you shift your experience of negative emotions toward positive emotions so that you can ultimately live in a more positive state, which we know influences your interaction with other people. And in visiting some of these schools, it's been fascinating to talk to the students, because the facility with which they describe their emotions and the emotions of others is really quite remarkable. It's an ease and a fluency, if you will, with emotions that I certainly never had when I was a child, but it's really serving them well right now. As far as companies go, there are more companies that are recognizing the importance of this. I think nobody has solved this problem entirely. There are strategies I've certainly seen that are being attempted and are just now starting to be studied. There was, one organization that I came across that they decided what they were going to do to help promote connection is that they were going to end the workday, at a very strict time. And they were going to actually ensure that people did not check email over during vacation time. And they had some specific strategies for how to actually do this, but their reasoning was as follows. They said, if connection is important, and if some of the most powerful sources of connection that people have are to their family and their friends outside of work, then our work, if it's not constrained within reasonable timeframes, then that will crowd out those relationships. If work seeps into our evenings and our weekends and our vacation time, that's less time for us to spend with people in our lives who we love, and that means that those connections are getting weaker. And so they have taken some of those approaches, which may seem somewhat strict or somewhat unnecessary, but it turns out that the response from employees has, in the longer term, been quite strong. There's something else that we used to do in my office when I was serving as Surgeon General, which was a simple exercise that literally took 5 minutes a week. And it was called our inside scoop exercise. And what we did is we had recognized at one point that while we had people who came to the office and were for the mission, they were incredibly purpose-oriented. They came because they wanted to enhance the public health of the nation. That didn't necessarily mean that they were all tightly connected to each other. They respected each other, but we recognized that their connections could be more powerful. And we recognized that some people were in fact feeling isolated and lonely at work. So we initially thought, well, should we have more get-togethers? Maybe if we have more happy hours, people will have a chance to hang out. And we did a bit of that, and then quickly realized that what happens in happy hours is that you get people together for an hour or two. You're usually taking away from their family time, if this is time that's being spent outside of work hours, or they're having to go back to work to finish the work that they didn't get to do because they had to leave work early for the happy hour. And people get together and they talk about often what they have most in common, which is in fact work. And we wanted to help people get to know each other in a deeper and more substantive level than they already did. And we recognize that this is important because all of us as human beings have a fundamental need to be known, to understand each other. That doesn't mean that we need to bare our souls to everyone we work with. That doesn't mean that everyone needs to know our deepest and darkest secrets. But what it does mean is that being able to share and communicate our values to others, knowing that people know who we are and what drives us is important. It helps cement and strengthen connections between people. So during the 5 minutes that we would take each week during our weekly all-staff meetings, we asked one person during that meeting each time to share a series of pictures with the rest of the team. Pictures that could be about any dimension of their life, the work they did prior to getting to office, the work that they aspire to do later. It could be about their family, it could be about their hobbies. But those 5 minutes were so rich because we learned so much about each person in our group in their own terms. And it made us feel so much closer to that person, even though at the times we had been working with some of those people for over a year. So that simple exercise became really, really popular. And it became people's favorite meeting of the whole week. I at one point tried to cancel the meeting because we had a scheduling conflict and there was an uproar from people who said, no, you can't cancel it. This meeting is really important. It's the one we look forward to, all week. And so, that was a simple exercise. And the reason I mention that is not to say that when I was in office, we had all the solutions. We didn't. We were learning along the way. But it's to illustrate the fact that creating connection isn't about the quantity of time that you invest in activities. It's about the quality of that time. In the same way that our ability to feel connected to other people is not dependent on the number of people that we have connections with. It's dependent on the quality of those connections. It's for that reason that our world is filled with people who have thousands of followers on Twitter and who have thousands of friends on Facebook and who have thousands of contacts on LinkedIn. And they live in high-rise buildings with many residents, and they talk to people all the time at work, but they feel profoundly alone because it is the quality of those connections that ultimately matter. I'll lastly say I had a conversation just recently with a researcher, Robert Waldinger at Harvard Medical School, who is heading up a 75-year longitudinal study of people and asking a whole series of fascinating questions about their life, including what contributes to their happiness. But one of the questions that they have been asking people for years to understand whether they have a close confidant in their life is they ask them, they say, is there somebody that you would feel comfortable picking up the phone and calling at 3 in the morning if you were in the midst of a crisis? And what they found is that there were a large proportion of people who said, no, there's no one I would feel comfortable calling. This included many people who were in fact married and didn't feel comfortable calling their spouse. And this is actually backed up by Gallup data, which shows that we have an alarming proportion of people in our population who say that they don't have a single person in their life who they feel comfortable sharing personal challenges with. And so as we think about how to address connection, this is not just a challenge for the workplace, but it's a challenge more broadly in society. If we have developed all this technology to connect people, yet people are feeling more disconnected than ever before, then clearly there's more that we need to do to address that challenge.
It's such a powerful point that this, in many ways, is our ability to maintain larger and larger numbers of social connections has increased. And at the same time, we see that more people are reporting that they actually have no high quality connections or high trust connections, where really it is that from those types of social supports that we know translate into increased productivity in the workplace, increased health and well-being, higher levels of happiness. And it's amazing also the examples you gave about how very small changes in workplace practices can translate into pretty profound changes in the environment in which you're working and existing in during the majority of your day. I appreciate how you also began with physical health and well-being, so thinking about exercise and mobility. Do you think that there's a role that within the workplace or other social institutions that having increased mobility or exercise or actually focusing on the physical body can also help improve mental well-being as well as physical well-being?
Absolutely. Our ability to function in our heads is determined in part by how our body is functioning. And there's an old piece of wisdom that people have shared for years, that if you're feeling stuck on an idea, to just take a break and take a walk. And there's actually deeper wisdom to that, because when we take a walk or do any sort of physical activity, that actually does help to change our mood and to reduce stress in our body. There's actually data now that physical activity in certain circumstances can function as powerfully as an antidepressant when it comes to lifting our mood. So exercise is, in a way, a natural antidepressant, but it can also help us to shift our thinking and to think more clearly. One of the things that I started to do a few years ago is I started shifting my meetings from sitting meetings to walking meetings whenever possible. They took the same amount of time. We didn't take any special equipment and didn't cost anything. but it was a different way of going about my business. And I recognized two things happened as a result of that. One is I was getting more activity during my day, which actually helped me feel more energetic and to think more clearly actually throughout the day. But the other thing that I noticed was that my conversations were actually better, that when the other person was also walking, our minds were just working differently. We were a little bit more relaxed, and we were able to have often better conversations. You can't do every meeting as a walking meeting. If you have important slides that you have to present and you need 10 people together, it might be hard to go walking and to do that all at the same time. But there are a lot of meetings that we do one-on-one with small groups of 2 or 3 people. And a lot of those meetings could lend themselves to actually being done in a more mobile setting. So again, I think the key to this is not to think about how to completely overhaul your workplace from day one, but to think about the small changes that you can start to introduce that will not only make a meaningful difference in how people feel and function, that will also start to send signals to your workplace about the kind of culture that you ultimately want to create, a culture that's centered around people, a culture that optimizes health, and a culture that recognizes that our physical well-being and our emotional well-being are deeply tied to how productive and contributing we are at work.
That's a great example that links nicely to one of the questions from the audience, and I do encourage everyone who's listening in to submit questions that Dr. Murthy would be happy to answer. One of the questions we had was, I think relates very nicely to many of the points you've been making, is what effect do you think sort of doing a joint MBA and MD at the same time had on your way of seeing the world and your ability to both understand business problems, but also how to approach and tackle health challenges? Dr. Murthy's camera is frozen right now. We will give him just 1 second to catch up. In the meantime, while we're waiting for him to rejoin us, again, I would encourage you to submit questions over Zoom or Facebook that you have for Dr. Murthy, and he will be happy to answer them when he rejoins. Welcome back, Dr. Murthy.
Thank you so much. Sorry about the technical issues.
It's always a challenge.
Always. But I did hear your question about the joint MD MBA program. And let me say this. I feel so blessed to have been able to do the joint MD MBA program and to be able to do it at Yale in particular. Yale's a really special place. And my wife is also a Yale alum. She was an undergraduate at Yale, and she lived in Morse College. And we both have a deep, abiding affection for the university, because not just of what it gave us in terms of an education, but almost even more importantly, what it gave us in terms of a community and a community of people that deeply cared about us, that cared about the subjects we were studying, and that cared about contributing to making a better world. So really grateful for that experience. But I'll tell you why I actually did it. And what I ended up getting out of my experience at Yale SOM was actually somewhat different from what I thought I would get. I decided to do an MBA degree in addition to my, in addition to the MD, because I wanted to learn how to build effective organizations. I had spent several years prior to entering medical school building a nonprofit organization that was doing HIV prevention work in India. It was an extraordinary experience. I learned so much, but I also was acutely aware during that time that there was a lot I didn't know, and that I felt like I was reinventing the wheel and trying to figure out how to think about branding, how to develop strategies, internal strategies for for creating a healthy organization. And I went to the School of Management hoping to understand more about how to do that effectively. When I got there, I realized a couple of things. One is that, certainly the skill set that I needed, I realized was far broader than what I thought. I recognized there was a complexity to creating effective organizations that, despite my experience, I had not fully appreciated. And I learned so much about that from the faculty and students. But there was also something else that I recognized, which is that the School of Management taught me to look at change as a force in our world very differently than how medicine was teaching me to look at change. In the world of medicine, I recognized change was looked at with concern, with skepticism, with apprehension. sometimes for good reason. For example, you wouldn't want your surgeon just suddenly experimenting with a new technique that came to mind, in the middle of your operation, something that wasn't tested or proven to work. And so for that, and other reasons, change is looked at with skepticism until it's proven to actually work to deliver the outcomes that we need for patient care. In the world of business and management, what I realized is that change was looked at slightly differently. It was looked at more as an opportunity to create something better, an opportunity to contribute more, and to ultimately to make people's lives better. But it involved taking risk, and it involved being thoughtful about that risk. And I recognized when I came back to medicine after finishing the School of Management that it was almost like putting on a different set of glasses and looking at the world through a different lens, and looking at change again, not as a source of fear, not as something to push aside, but it really is a source of opportunity. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest gifts that I got from SOM was that shift in perspective. So it's one of the reasons, one of many, that I will always be very grateful to the institution. I should also just say more broadly, though, about doing joint MD MBA programs. There are a lot of students I talk to who are wondering, do I need to do a joint degree, in order to have credibility or to have the skills that I need to make a difference in the world? And I actually don't think that everyone needs to have a joint degree if you want to do something at the intersection of two fields. It might seem obvious that you should, but I think that there's a tremendous amount to be gained just by going out and doing it. So when it comes to public health, for example, I've spent really a huge chunk of the last 2 decades working on building public health enterprises and working on public health issues, but I don't have a master's in public health. I decided not to get an MPH. Now, could I learn more by getting an MPH? Sure, we can always learn more by getting an additional degree. But the choices that we have to make in our life about when we want to learn and when we want to immerse ourselves in experience and learn by experience. And so there's a lot you can learn by doing. And so I encourage people to be open to doing joint degrees, but to be skeptical about the narrative that says that you need to do those, for credibility or for your experience. It's good for some people. It's not necessary for everyone.
So based on your experience and thinking about change in general, right? If we think about large-scale social change, one of the questions from the audience is, how do you feel we can move the dial on broader societal attitudes that undervalue connection and empathetic communication? So how can we think about creating a large-scale social change and a cultural shift around these issues?
Well, I think that's a really important and really challenging proposition, because the questioner is absolutely right. We do need a broader scale shift in attitudes and culture when it comes to how we think about emotions. And I think there are a couple of things that we need to do if we really want emotions to be seen for what they are, a great source of power and a source of potential, as opposed to a source of weakness and frailty. And number one of the things that we have to do is we have to, as a society, invest more in the science of emotional well-being. That means funding research that helps us understand more of how emotions actually impact us and what actually works to cultivate positive emotions. But the second thing that we have to do is we have to also study programs that are already out there and understand what's working about them and how do we get them at scale? How do we adapt them for the workplace, for schools, etc.? And then the third thing we have to do on the cultural front is we have to think about how people's attitudes are shaped in the first place. So when it comes to how we think about emotions, it turns out that our attitudes toward emotions are shaped really early in life, in preschool and elementary school, if not before that. And so what that means is that if we want to shift culturally how people think about emotions, we got to start early. We have to invest in programs in schools that help kids learn what emotions are, identify and manage their own emotions, and that's going to be essential. But I think that there's also, on the cultural front, an important role right now, in particular, for us to embark on a communications campaign, a campaign that really is aimed at helping the public understand not just the fact that emotions can be powerful and helpful, but to hear the stories of how emotions have in fact played a part in some of the biggest successes that people have had. A great place to look to for these stories is in fact sports. So if you in fact look at who understands the power of emotions, it's actually elite athletes who understand that. The people who are at the top of their game, Serena Williams, the LeBron Jameses of the world, elite athletes, they understand that the difference between good and great is not how much time you spend in the weight room. It's not how much time you spend on the treadmill, but it's that you need that physical fitness. But the real difference between good and great is also in your mental game and how you manage your emotions. When you're in there was a saying, that I used to hear often when I was a young kid watching Wimbledon tennis and the US Open tennis, which is people would often say, when you get to the fifth set, the final set of tennis, it's not about skill, it's about heart. And it's about your ability to manage the jitters, the negative emotions, and translate them into positive emotions that drive you to higher and higher levels of performance. And so part of, I think, what we need athletes and business leaders and others to tell the stories of how emotions play a role in their life, how they manage their emotions, but also how they cultivate positive emotions in themselves and in other people that they work with. We think about incentives a lot in business and management. And we think about how to optimize incentives so our employees will be maximally productive. Well, I think we've spent a fair amount of time thinking about financial incentives, but there are other incentives that are equally, if not more powerful, I believe, for many people. For many people, they want to work in a place where they feel a sense of connection to the mission and to the people around them. They want to come to a place where they feel not more stress, but in fact less stress when they come to work, because even though the work's going to be tough and it's going to be hard, they feel confident in the team that they have, that they're working with. And I think optimizing for that is not essentially for emotional well-being in a company, can be a distinct competitive advantage, both for recruitment and ultimately for competition and performance. But I think that for that to really become part of the culture of business, part of the culture in our schools, part of the culture more broadly in society, we need leaders in sports and business and in education and in politics, all to be talking about their own personal experiences of actually doing this, of using emotions to actually perform better, to contribute more, and to do more.
Well, thank you so much. In that respect, you're very much a leader in getting this communication campaign started. So thank you for playing your part in getting this discussion going. I'm extremely grateful, and I know that many, many people are also benefiting from the work you've been doing in this regard.
Well, thank you so much.
Along these same lines, another question that came in is sort of how does work-life balance impact emotional, physical, and mental well-being? What's your position on this concept, and do you have any advice for companies that are trying to achieve this balance?
Yeah, work-life balance has been something we've been talking about for several decades now, and it feels, it reminds me to some extent of the challenges we have with obesity in our country, both really complicated problems that are multifactorial that we've been talking about for a while, but we're not entirely sure that we made a lot of progress on either end. And I think when it comes to work-life balance, I think the key is that, everyone's the right balance for everyone is going to be a bit different. So there are some people who just saying that everyone should only work 9 to 5 and no one should work before 9 or after 5, that may or may not be the best solution for every company. But it's really individual, and it changes over the course of our life. I know that in my own life, for example, that when I was beginning my tech company with a few colleagues, that was a period of my life where I was single and I didn't have children or other commitments outside of work, and I was not only able to pour myself into work, but I wanted to. I wanted to put in the 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week, and I was just so fueled by the idea that we were trying to build. At this point in my life, where I have a wife, I have a small child, I have another child on the way, I still have things that I'm very passionate about that I want to contribute to the world. But there's a different balance that I need. I need to be home, in time for bedtime and for mealtime for my son, because I want to be, and because that's important for me and for our family. I want to be there for important occasions for him, and in the future when he has games or important events at school, I want to be there. So I think that part of work-life balance is actually about flexibility, as opposed to always thinking about how much people work. It's about giving people the flexibility to be able to move in and out of the workplace in a way that will accommodate the demands of their life. And some of this actually, it was related to connection, because to create an environment where you have that kind of flexibility requires trust. It requires people to be able to trust that, okay, if somebody is actually not here between 1 and 3 in the afternoon, it's not because they're slacking off or they're at the beach. It's because they have some other important commitment, and we trust that they're the kind of person who understands us, values us, cares about the project, and they're going to come back and they're going to finish their work, and ultimately they're going to get things done, by the timeline that the company needs. And so the connections that you have between people are really important because connections are based on trust, and trust is what you need for flexible arrangements to actually work. But the last thing I'll say about this is that if a company really wants to create a work-life balance, the most important place to start is to ask people what they want in the company. And the answers that you get when you do that may surprise you. People may actually not be averse to working as many hours as you think they might be concerned about, or they might want flexibility in an area that you didn't recognize that they actually need. So when I was starting, my tenure as Surgeon General, we said from the very beginning that we wanted our office to be a place that would be family friendly, that would allow and accommodate all the elements of people's lives that made them who they were, that made them the kind of person that made us want to actually bring them into the office of the Surgeon General to begin with. That meant accommodating some of their extracurricular interests. It meant accommodating their family and their close friends. And that's what we tried very hard to do. Were we always successful? No. But we made that a value from the beginning. We talked to people in the office about it to understand what their needs were. And then we set about building a structure and a culture of operating that was responsive to those needs.
It's a really profound sort of the link you just made between the importance of trust and social connection and creating the flexibility to actually begin to implement policies and changes that allow sort of for much more flourishing, whether that be in work-life balance or other positive spillovers that happen once we can start to create cohesive communities and cultures. Along those same lines, but sort of the flip side of this, Michael Denham submitted a question asking that as we struggle as a country to come together and discuss healthcare reform, that oftentimes those can be very polarizing discussions. So what are some ways that individuals can actively engage with family members, friends, or peers to discuss potential policies without having those conversations derail into negative rhetoric and become polarizing?
Well, gosh, just coming off of the holidays, what a timely question this is, where I've had so many people who have spent time, around the dinner table, wondering if they should bring up a topic or not, or dreading the surfacing of some political discussion that they know is going to cause conflict. Look, this is a big challenge, not just within families, but within communities. People everywhere that I meet are worried, deeply worried about the toxic nature of dialogue in our country. They're worried that we're not talking to each other, that we, in the face of adversity, instead of coming together to tackle tough problems, that we are instead retreating to our corners and throwing stones at each other, and ultimately not succeeding in addressing the challenges for ourselves and for future generations. And I'm worried about the same thing, as somebody who loves, our country, as somebody who has, a young child and another on the way. I want us to create a better country for the future. But this is not just about America. I want to be clear.
We've lost Dr. Murthy again, and we'll wait for him to reconnect. And as you're waiting, please do submit questions. We have some excellent questions coming in with lots of important topics that we look forward to discussing when Dr. Murthy rejoins us. Welcome back.
Hi there. Sorry about our tech issues here. But, I think, to come back to the conversation and to where we were, this issue that we started talking about division and how we come together to talk about difficult subjects, whether it's about healthcare or whether it's about other topics, this is a concern for the United States and for many communities all around the world. So a few things that I would say. Number one is, if we want to have discussions about difficult topics with people, then we want those discussions to lead to a productive solution. It's absolutely essential that we first invest in building trust with the people that we're talking to. There's a reason that certain family members and close friends can have difficult conversations and still remain friends and still actually make progress in their discussions. It's because even though they may be having conflict, they know that there's a deeper well of affection and trust that lies, beneath the surface, if you will, that I think is the foundation for that discussion. There's an interesting tidbit of research on this that I actually find fascinating. In the 75-year-long Harvard study that's being done, looking at a cohort of men and trying to understand what drives their health and their happiness. One of the interesting things that the researchers did is they actually video recorded conversations that the men were having with their spouses over the years about difficult topics, about a big challenge that they were facing in their life. And what they found is that when the couples, very often these discussions would lead to actually a point of conflict because the challenge usually required difficult decisions to be made and there wasn't always agreement on those. But what they did is they recognized that there was a certain indicator that they could look for when they observed that conflict taking place that would actually help them predict with about 85% accuracy whether that couple was going to stay together for the long term or not. And that variable that they looked for was the presence of affection in the midst of conflict. So couples that were arguing but were still able to express their affection to each other, whether it was in a simple touch or whether it was through the use of humor and laughter, whether it was by hugging it out from time to time, whatever it was, the presence of affection, it turns out, made it easier for them to navigate challenging conversations. And that is true more broadly as we think about our families, our communities, and our country and the world, is that we need to cultivate connections between people, because without those connections, we can't have conversations about challenging topics. If we don't have a degree of respect and regard and concern and compassion for the people whose destinies we share, by virtue of the fact that we all inhabit this world, then we can't really respect them enough to have a conversation and respect their views, and we're not inclined to give way, if you will, in our own minds for a different point of view. And so this is why my work around social connection and loneliness, my work around emotional well-being, is motivated by a deeper concern I have, not just about health, but about how we function as a society. I do believe that it is our connection with each other that is the foundation on which we build everything else: our health, our economy, our education, and our sense of security and well-being. And if we don't invest there first, then we are building everything else on a foundation that's made of sand. And in difficult times, under the weight of challenging issues, that foundation will collapse and we'll be left mired in conflict and unable to really get to solutions. So at times when we feel that we're getting stuck in a conversation with somebody, I always find it helpful to ask myself the question, what's my relationship with this person? Do I trust them? Do they trust me? Do I understand their values and what's driving them? Do I know their interests? Or am I just stuck on their positions and focused on issues which may be superficial but aren't really at the core of who they are? And if I realize if I haven't cultivated that connection, that relationship, that discussion is not usually going to go as far as it can. And if I have that connection, but it's sort of in the past and I've forgotten it, then I sometimes realize I need to rekindle it. We need to resurface, bring the discussion back to actually what we deeply care about. Why are we doing this? Why are we having this conversation? Maybe it's because we both have elderly parents and we're really worried about the future of the healthcare system and how it's going to affect them. Maybe we're having this deep discussion about the education system, even though we're on opposite sides of the fence, because we both have kids who are about to start kindergarten and we're wondering what the next 12 years is going to be like for them in the school system, and is it going to really serve them well? So building that connection on a foundation of values, that's what we need to do right now in our society if we want to have productive discussions, if we want to ultimately come together in the face of adversity and drive towards solutions.
Thinking more broadly about moving towards solutions, moving from sort of the level of social connection and social cohesion, What do you think are 2 or 3 of the most important policy changes that the U.S. could make overall to improve health over the next 10 years? So pretend that there were no constraints. If you could make 2 or 3 policy changes, what do you think some of the most important ones would be?
So a few things that I would do if, if you had unlimited resources and no political friction to deal with, I think number one, changing how we pay for healthcare is absolutely essential. We still, to a great degree, pay for the volume of care that's delivered. We don't often enough pay for quality of care, although that's changing, thanks in part to steps that have been taken over the last 6 to 7 years. But we also don't pay for prevention. Even when we do pay for quality, we pay for the quality of health care that's delivered. We don't pay for the investment that's made in prevention to create health, so that people don't in fact need more healthcare later down the line. And that's actually a business model problem that we have in the United States. And so we have to shift to a place where we start to see sidewalks as actually being as important a public health intervention as some of the treatments that we invest billions of dollars in developing. So changing the business model of how we pay for healthcare, creating policies that invest in prevention so that we're investing as much in prevention as we do in treatment. Those would be 2 big changes that I would like to make. And then very specifically, when it comes to emotional well-being, I would invest significantly in all sort of levels when it comes to emotional well-being, both the basic research that's needed to study at a cellular level how our emotions impact us and how to optimize them. I would also invest in studying at a programmatic level what works to actually enhance our positive emotions and our function. And I would invest in helping programs to scale, because I'm a big believer that that real change happens when you engage and empower the private sector to innovate and to be creative and to employ great solutions. But we need to sometimes support the private sector with research and with other tools and with collaboratives that can bring learning together so people know what works and what doesn't. That's one of the most common questions I get when I actually visit with communities. People want to know what works actually to address addiction, what works to address obesity and heart disease, what works. And if we know what works, then we can try to implement that. So those are some areas that I would invest in, if from a public policy perspective. And that applies not just to the United States, but I think there are many countries that could benefit from those kind of investments.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and now there's a flood of questions coming in exactly along the lines of your last comment on sort of what works. And I really appreciate the distinction you're drawing about the importance of connecting across all sort of different levels, from interpersonal interactions to thinking about sort of what's happening at the organizational level and what sort of institutions can do, as well as connecting to larger scale policy changes. And Yusuf Higgins had one question along these lines about do you have any advice for better emotional well-being within schools in particular? And also, what are some ways one can build strong connections with their peers?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think that when it comes to schools, there are a growing number of programs that are actually looking at how to equip students with the skills to not only understand their emotions, but also regulate their emotions, particularly negative emotions. One of those programs is actually very close to you, Marissa, and that's actually a program called the Ruler Program, developed by the Yale Emotional Wellbeing Institute, a program that is being implemented in over 1,600 schools right now. So I would encourage you to look at the Ruler Program, that's R-U-L-E-R. That's one of several programs that have done a really interesting job in helping kids when it comes to enhancing emotional well-being. When it comes to the second part of your question, which is how do you build or strengthen your connections with other people, particularly in the workplace? Well, the program that I described to you that we implemented in the Office of the Surgeon General, the 5 minutes a week of just getting to understand some dimension of someone's life outside of work, that's actually something that one can essentially do without a formalized program. One of the things I actually used to do at Yale that I'll share with you is that when I got to Yale, I was in a new environment and I was feeling somewhat, disconnected and somewhat lonely myself. And I found that I was truthfully never somebody who was great at, sort of making small talk and going to big parties. And I would always feel, a little awkward, in those settings, although that sort of changed over time. But what I used to do is I would, in fact, meet with people just for lunch, one-on-one. We would just have lunch together, one-on-one, and we would just talk. We would talk about our lives. We would talk about each other. And what I would find is just in spending 30 minutes with someone having lunch, I would often develop such a deeper understanding of who they are and appreciation for their values than I did, spending 6 months together with them in a class and just bumping, into them incidentally. So I found that small amount of really quality time made a big difference. But what's really interesting is that I feel that a lot of times it doesn't occur to us to do this, to take that kind of initiative. But when it does, like the results are often quite profound. And it turns out many other people are really receptive to having that kind of time, because it's actually somewhat uncommon in society today for people to have quality time one-on-one with others, especially if they have families or busy lives. So that's a simple tool that I might recommend. Just the 30-minute lunches that you can use with people to just have a real conversation with them, not about work, just about who they are. That's time that will not only help you appreciate and understand them, but people feel so appreciative that you care to understand about who they are. And in that mutual appreciation evolves trust and connection and the foundation for better collaboration and also just for a more enjoyable work environment.
Well, that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for taking the time to connect with us today and share a little bit more about who you are and what your values are. The work you're doing is incredibly important on social connection and emotional well-being, and the ability to sort of share that with others will hopefully cascade and create a positive change for everyone who's listening today, as well as the work that you're doing broadly in society. So thank you so much, Dr. Murthy.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much, Marissa, for covering this topic and choosing to focus on loneliness and more broadly on emotional well-being, not just in this hour, but also in the research that you do. I think the fact that we're having this conversation itself is a sign that times are changing. 10, 15, 20 years ago, a conversation like this may have been looked at as somewhat strange and out of the ordinary and maybe not so relevant or important to the major issues that we're facing today. But the more we understand about science, about how the world works, the more we understand that our emotions are deeply tied to the big issues that we're facing, whether it's violence or addiction or challenges with dialogue and collaboration. We need to understand emotions and we need to harness their power in order to achieve our full potential, whether you're in a company or in a school or elsewhere in society. So I'm grateful for this opportunity that we had. I'm hopeful that everyone who joined us today will leave with recognizing that emotions are in fact not a source of weakness, but one of our greatest sources of power. And if that starts a journey in your own life or in your own company or your institution of exploring how to enhance emotional well-being, then that means that this time was well spent. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks, Dr. Murthy, and thank you to everyone who joined us today.